So today, in just a little bit, we're going to be getting into these verses specifically in chapter 6, verses 16 through 34. But when we look at this one specific passage towards the end of the chapter here, this is one of these passages that Christians often take personally as a promise from Jesus to them. And I do want to remind you that Jesus, in speaking the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we're at in Matthew, Jesus was speaking to a Jewish audience. Jesus was speaking to a Jewish audience, and they all lived under the Mosaic Law. And we have to be very careful when we're reading passages that deal with the Jews under the Mosaic Law. Be very careful when we try to pull verses out of there and claim those as promises for ourselves. You just can't arbitrarily do that correctly. I mean, you can do it. The question is whether it is actually true or not. And so I want to remind you that was the old covenant. We are under the new covenant. In addition to that, I want to remind you that the law, the Mosaic Law, the Old Covenant was never given to Gentiles. It was given specifically to Jewish people. It never was. In addition to that, I want to remind you of what the New Testament actually says about the New Covenant. It made the Old Covenant obsolete. That's Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. So we have to take these things in context if we're going to understand what Jesus was actually trying to teach on that day, and be careful how we make application to us and claim promises that aren't really ours. So with that said, we're going to go back to the subject of, Jesus goes back to the subject of external righteousness versus internal righteousness, and that's where we begin this morning. This specifically talks about fasting for attention, and we begin with verse 16. Whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance, so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. So again, Jesus assumed that they would fast when he said, whenever you fast. Why did he assume that? Because fasting was associated with the Day of Atonement in the Mosaic Law, and we're still under the law at this point. And I want to emphasize, notice I said was associated with the Day of Atonement. Because if you read about the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament, the Jews believed that it was required as a day of physical fasting from food. But if you look at the passages, it never specifically says that. They just assumed that as part of their ritual of that day, they would abstain from all food on that day. But again, it never specifically commands that. It was more of an assumption, or maybe they were going sort of above and beyond what was required. So we want to start from there. They understood that in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29 and 31, where it said denying themselves, that included fasting, but it doesn't specifically say that. However, let me also say that that's what the Jews did. When the Day of Atonement came, they would fast for that day, and that was the way that they denied themselves. Interestingly enough, when we get into the New Testament in the book of Acts, and Paul is referring to, Luke writing, but Paul is referring to the Day of Atonement. It's called the fast. But again, it's not something that was specifically called out. However, we do know that in the Old Testament, there were instances where Jewish people fasted. For instance, Moses, when he was on Mount Sinai, he was there for 40 days and nights. And what did he do when he was there? He fasted. In addition to that, go from there, fast forward to Elijah. And Elijah fasted for 40 days and nights when he was on Mount Horeb. Fast forward in the Old Testament, Jesus. Remember, Jesus is living under the Old Testament. I know that at the beginning of Matthew it says the New Testament. But the New Testament doesn't begin until Jesus dies on the cross. Because for a covenant to begin, there must be the shedding of blood and death. So Jesus also fasted for 40 days and 40 nights after his baptism when his ministry was going to begin. But I want to point out that none of these instances of fasting were actually required of the Jews under the Mosaic Law. However, they believed that they had to fast during the Day of Atonement. And so Jesus makes the assumption that they are going to fast. Because after all, he knew about the Day of Atonement and their practices. But in addition to that, he also knew that they added more times each week when they fasted. And so the tradition of religious leaders fasting was much more often than once a year. As a matter of fact, in Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, verse 12, Luke tells us that the Pharisees fasted not just once a year, but twice a week. Now, that's a lot. I don't know if you've ever fasted. Fasting is not an easy thing to do. Now, people make up all sorts of things when they fast. They go, well, I'm going to fast for, I'm not going to eat meat. Or I'm not going to eat this, or I'm not going to, and then some people just do it completely. But whatever you're doing, fasting in and of itself is not easy. But in addition to that, New Covenant Christians, it's not required of us to fast. If you want to fast, you can, but it is not a requirement. So the religious leaders, the Pharisees, fasted twice a week. But as I look at this verse and I point out that Jesus assumed they would fast, what we have today is in modern Christianity, we have preachers that tell you that you're expected to fast. You've maybe heard preachers tell you that you should fast. And again, I want to point out, fasting is not required. But if you want to fast, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm just pointing out that it's not a requirement. But again, Jesus expected that they would be fasting, and that's how he begins this section here. So when the Jews fasted, the focus was supposed to be on God, not themselves. And Jesus is pointing out here that that's the opposite of what they were doing. Hypocritical, self-righteous, self-centered fasting did absolutely nothing for them spiritually. It did zero for them. They received no blessing from God, and their reward, as Jesus says, was limited to the people that saw them, because they made themselves look bad. And the attention was to themselves. And Jesus was pointing out, this is not righteousness. Oh, this is self-righteousness, but it's not true being right with God. So verses 17 and 18, he continued, but you, when you fast, again, there's the assumption that they were going to do it. What are you supposed to do? Anoint your head and wash your face, so that your fasting will not be noticed by men. It's almost similar to what he said about prayer. You're not praying out in the open to get attention. Go into your closet and pray. But by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. I want to remind you, Jesus pointing out here that fasting, whether on the Day of Atonement or twice a week, wasn't to be self-centered, but God-centered. And if it wasn't God-centered, then you weren't going to get any credit, if you will, from God. All the benefits you got was from the people that saw you. And how would they see? How do you know if somebody's fasting? Well, if I just don't eat a meal, you don't know it. Unless we happen to go to lunch and I say, I'm fasting. Just to let you know, nothing is going to be ordered for me. But how are people going to know it unless, as Jesus points out, they didn't wash their head, they didn't wash their face, because they wanted to be noticed. So people would look at them and say, oh, how holy they are. Look how spiritual they are. Jesus is saying, on the contrary, you're not spiritual at all. It's all of the flesh. You're doing it for yourself. And God certainly was not going to bless that. Remember again, the old covenant was conditional. And God promised to bless those who faithfully followed the covenant. And so if they believed, and if it was correct that they would fast on the Day of Atonement, the only one that might have been required, then God would certainly bless them. Why? Because they were following the law. If they did not follow the law, then they would not receive blessing, and they might even be cursed by God. That was part of the Mosaic Law. So from the topic of fasting, Jesus then moves on to the topic of treasures. So we look at verses 19 and 20. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. So again, since their focus was supposed to be on God, Jesus did not want them to focus on earthly treasures, because they could be eaten up by moths, they could rust, they could be stolen. He wanted them to focus on something that was going to last. Couldn't be stolen, couldn't be eaten away. Verse 21, he continues, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So, if they were genuinely right with God, then God would be their treasure, and their heart would be in heaven, spiritually speaking, with Him. But if all they were focused on was this material possessions, that's where their heart was going to be. And if the moths ate it, if the thieves broke in and stole it, they would be brokenhearted. And Jesus is simply saying here, if your treasure is in this world, that's where your heart is going to be. He wanted them to elevate their focus. Elevate where their treasure was. Their treasure should have been God. He made a specific covenant with the Jewish people. He chose them. They were His chosen people. It was the Jewish people that the Messiah was to come through. It was through the Jewish people that the entire world would be blessed through Jesus Christ. And if their focus was on God, their treasure would be heavenly, their treasure would be spiritual, and by the way, their treasure would have been the Messiah, Jesus Christ. But it wasn't. Everything in this world is temporary. I don't care how well it's built. And let me tell you something. Things are not built as well as they used to be. My mother had a dryer, a clothes dryer, that my father purchased for her probably when I was an infant. That dryer lasted until I was at least 40 years old. When the people from Lowe's came to get it, they were amazed it actually still ran. Now, the bottom of it was kind of rusted because it was in her basement, but it still worked. But the point is, nothing is eternal in this world. Nothing is going to last forever. However, a relationship with Jesus Christ is eternal. And He wanted them to have this relationship with the Messiah, to recognize Him, to believe in Him, so that their focus would be on God, not all the things of this world, which was temporary. Now, from that point, Jesus spoke of a focus on God or a focus on evil. We go from there to verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. So Jesus is simply making here a spiritual analogy based on a physical reality. Everyone understood what Jesus was talking about. Now I find it interesting that the word clear meant something that was simple or single. And the idea of the word was to be a singleness of purpose. To be focused on something. Now, what should they have been focused on? God. That's where their focus should have been. However, if the Jews had a singleness of vision, their eye, they would have been focused on God. And then they would be full of spiritual light. And so Jesus is making a point here about choices that they're going to make. Whether they're going to focus on God, the light's going to come in. The light's going to illuminate them spiritually speaking. Verse 23, he continues. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? In other words, if their focus was not on God, their vision was evil. Their eye is bad. Then they would be full of spiritual darkness. If the vision wasn't on God, if it's on material things, their vision is the wrong place. They're not looking for the light. They're looking for darkness. And if they're focused on darkness, what's going to be inside them? Darkness. If the eye is bad. Then Jesus gets to His point. No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Or the old King James word was mammon. And I remember the first time reading that, and I was like, what's that? What's mammon? It's just talking about wealth. So there was no in-between. They either had faith in God or they lacked faith in God. By the way, that has not changed. You're either a believer or you're not a believer. There is no in-between. There is no, well, I'm sort of. No, you either made the choice or you haven't. And you know if you've made that choice or not, because it is a decision of your will. And God is not putting your hand behind your back and twisting your arm, making you choose Him. No, as I've said many times, God is a gentleman and He doesn't force Himself upon anyone. So we have to make a choice. They had to make a choice. Did they want light or did they want darkness? And this has not changed. People today have to make a choice. Do they want light, Jesus Christ, or do they want darkness, just about everything else? That choice must be made. So Jesus came to reveal God to them. Remember, this is the Jewish people. They should have known God. He had a covenant with them. He was God. Jesus was God incarnate. They had to make a choice. Would they believe in Him? Would they accept Him as Messiah? Or would they reject Him? Now, we know the end of the story. But the end of the story hasn't taken place yet. Jesus is making this appeal to them. They had to choose God, to serve God, or choose what the world offered, wealth. And the world is always offering wealth or any other substitute besides actually choosing God. And since they had to make a choice, Jesus gave them reassurance of what God promised. What He promised through the Mosaic Law. Please don't divorce the Mosaic Law from this passage, because if you do, you will claim a promise that is not there. This is still the Mosaic Law. It is a conditional covenant, and Jesus is going to remind them of how God wants to bless them. But they have to believe. They have to trust God. They have to put their faith in what God presented to them, this Mosaic covenant, and they were required to follow it. And if they did, God would provide for them. That was a promise in the Old Covenant. A guaranteed promise from God. So, if they made the right choice to serve God and follow the Mosaic Law, then they did not need to worry about their life. They did not need to worry about what they would eat, what they would drink, the clothes that they would wear, because God promised to provide for them. I mean, He did it for 40 years in the wilderness. Even though they'd made a mistake to not believe God and go take the promised land, they disbelieved, and yet God still provided manna for them for 40 years. Their clothes did not wear out. They never went hungry. Now, they may have gotten tired of manna, and we know they did, but God provided for them. And this is what Jesus wants them to remember. Because again, I remind you, this is the Mosaic Law. They're under the Mosaic Law. It's still Old Covenant. So we move there to verse 25. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? So he starts with, for this reason. God made promises to the faithful Jews. Therefore, they did not need to worry. For this reason, you're under the law. You're the Jewish people. You're my people. I've chosen you. I've now sent my Messiah to you. You don't have to worry, but you have to believe. You have to have faith in God. Again, Jesus reminded them, God promised to take care of their needs, what you will eat or what you will drink. The needs of faithful Jews and a faithful nation. The Mosaic Law contains specific promises from God for faithfulness. And part of those promises were provision. They would have food. They would have clothing. The enemies would not win against them. God promised that 10 of their people would chase 100 enemies away. 100 would chase 1,000 enemies away. They would be the head of the dog, not the tail. But He also warned them, if you do not believe, if you do not have faith, then 10 of them will chase 100 of you. 100 of them would chase 1,000 away. You'd be the tail of the dog, not the head. He warned them. As a matter of fact, as they're going into the promised land, Moses divided up the people, and part of them were on this mountain, part of them were on this mountain, and this group pronounced all the blessings of the Mosaic Law. And this group pronounced all the curses of the Mosaic Law. I don't know about you, I'd rather be on the blessing side. But that was the point. It was a conditional covenant. The Mosaic Law had always been conditional. This law was not given to the church. By the way, those promises were also not given to the church. Find me in the New Testament, the epistles, where Paul, Peter, James, John, Jude make promises to faithful believers that God will always provide clothing for them, that God will always provide food for them, that God will always protect them from enemies. Search hard. It's not there. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul wrote these words. Now, he's talking about the love of God. He says, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine, nakedness or danger or sword? Now, that's never going to separate us from the love of God. This is not a promise that we're not going to experience trouble or hardship or persecution, famine, nakedness, danger or sword. There is nothing that can separate believers from Christ's love and our future with Christ. But there is no promise in the New Testament for faithful Christians. They're not going to suffer all of these things. And I point out to you, look at every one of the apostles. How did they end their lives? Every one of them, except John, was executed. See, there's no old covenant promise for their protection because they're now in the new covenant. The blessing of their execution was to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord immediately. Paul did not fear death because he knew where he was going. There was no guarantee to Paul that he would be rescued. Matter of fact, you read 2 Timothy and you understand that Paul knows he is coming to the end of his life. Now, Paul was executed by being beheaded because he was a Roman Christian. He was a Roman citizen. The others had no blessing, no privilege like that of being Roman citizens. They were not. So we read of the traditions of how all the apostles were executed. There was no promise to protect them from that. That was the old covenant. And the old covenant was obsolete. All you have to do is look throughout history. How many faithful Christians were burned at the stake? Why? Because, for instance, they translated the Bible into English. And what happened to them, by the way? The church executed them. You just read history. Over and over, even in modern times, Christians have been executed. Christians have been crucified. You understand that what Jesus was saying was to the Jewish people under the law. This promise was not given in the new covenant. For one thing, there is a Jewish nation. There was the nation of Israel. It was a specific nation for a specific purpose, and God always provided that they would stay a nation, even though sometimes they were dispersed, because He had a purpose for them to bring Messiah into the world. And He needed a people group. He needed a nation in order to accomplish that, and He did. There's no Christian nation. There's Christians all over the world, but there's no Christian nation. A nation is Old Covenant, a single nation, the nation of Israel. And by the way, God's not done with them yet. Even though they are, for the most part, unfaithful, there is still a remnant of Jewish people, completed Jews, Messianic Jews. It's all the same. They have put their faith in Jesus Christ. And God's not done with them or the nation of Israel. So, Jesus reminded his Jewish audience that life was more than their physical needs. True life was faith in God. And that has not changed. True life is faith in God. True life is faith in Jesus Christ and allowing Him to live through you. Why? So He can produce through you spiritual fruit. So that you can reflect Jesus Christ. So that you can be the witness to the world of Jesus Christ and the change that He makes in each and every one of us spiritually. That if we allow Him to, that will be shining through us. And He will produce His fruit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. These are the promises of the new covenant. More than a nation, more than physical provision. It is spiritual provision that doesn't end even though we've been saved. It's the beginning there, but it continues as we reflect Jesus Christ. And what a greater promise that is than just physical provision. Spiritual provision that goes beyond death. But this is an old covenant reminder. Verse 26, Jesus continues. Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And so he points out that God cared for His creation. The Jews were part of His creation and specifically chosen as a nation. They were valuable to God. Why? Because He had a covenant relationship with them. He had promises that He made to them. And what is interesting to me as well is we also have a covenant relationship with God. But our covenant is greater than the old covenant. Our covenant is total forgiveness of sins. Our covenant is once for all forgiven. Past, present, future. All sins have been paid for on the cross. Our covenant is one step even better than that because we have right now within us resurrection life, the life of Jesus Christ dwelling within us because He is in us and we are in Him. So when God sees us, He sees the reflection of His Son, Jesus Christ, in us and through us. We not only have resurrection life right now, we have a glorified body coming. And I don't know about you, but as I age, every single day, I look forward to a glorified body because it ain't getting any better. These are the promises that we have. We're not like in the old covenant where they had the Day of Atonement repeated every single year, year after year after year. No, ours is once for all forgiveness. Once and done. So we are under a covenant, but it is a greater covenant. We're still in a covenant relationship with God through Jesus Christ. He continued, though, verses 27 through 29. And who of you being worried can add a single hour to your life? Why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say unto you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. Now I want to point something out here. How many Gentiles would have known who Solomon was? Maybe Gentiles that are familiar with maybe Jewish friends. But Gentiles in Greece, Thessalonica, Berea, the Galatian churches, Ephesus. How many of them would have known who Solomon was? Very few, if any. However, Jesus is not talking to Gentiles, and every Jew would have known exactly who Solomon was. Because Solomon was the richest king of all Israel. It was the last time the kingdom was united under Solomon. And he started off real good. Somewhere along the line, he blew it big time. And after him, the kingdom was divided. But every Jew knew who Solomon was. So what Jesus does here at the beginning of this, he stated the obvious, that worrying did not add anything to their lives, nor did it clothe them. Let me tell you what worrying will do for you. It's not going to add anything to your life, but it sure can shorten your life. If you worry enough, you may have a heart attack. You may have digestive problems, ulcers, all from worrying. And they would have known that too, just like you and I do. So Jesus begins by stating the obvious. God would clothe them. Why? Because it was part of the Mosaic Law blessings. Jesus referred to Solomon again, the wealthiest of all kings of Israel under the Mosaic Law. However, Solomon's wealth and all the beauty in his kingdom did not compare to God's simplicity in creation. And it still doesn't. There's nothing that man can create that can even come close to a beautiful sunset or a sunrise. There's nothing that compares to that in God's creation. So Jesus pointed out that flowers thrived in accordance with God's design. And all of Solomon's glory did not compare to God's design in creation. Jesus continues in verse 30. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, how much more will He... Wait a minute, that word clothe. I crossed it out. Why did I do that? No, I'm not subtracting from the Bible. It's actually not in the Greek text, and I looked into several different places. So he's just talking about how much more is God going to do for you, and it goes beyond clothing. So God's design for creation, He cared for creation, but He also cared for this design that He had for faithful Jews who lived under the Mosaic Law. And so God would take care of them. Jesus reminded the Jews that God had a promise in the Mosaic Law to do more than just clothe them. He would care for all of their needs, much more you, Jewish people, faithful Jews living under the Mosaic Law. Their problem, though, was lack of faith. By the way, that is still the problem with the vast majority of Jewish people in the world today. Their lack of faith. If you don't believe me, read Hebrews. There is a reason why, later after it was written, the title was called Hebrews. Because that letter was written to the Jews. And if you don't understand that, and the writer of that letter is addressing Jewish people who have heard, they know others they're living in the new covenant, but they're questioning whether they should go back to the old covenant. And so the writer is telling them this new covenant is far superior than the old covenant. It's infinitely greater than the old covenant. And that's the reality. The problem was the writer of the Hebrews was writing to Jewish people who the vast majority of them lacked faith. And he's pointing out why the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. If you don't understand that going into Hebrews, you're not going to understand what the writer was saying. But additionally, when we look at this, we have to understand that Jesus was speaking to Jews under the law. And you cannot just arbitrarily pull things out and say, I'm claiming this promise, when it wasn't given to you. So Jesus is encouraging them. They have a lack of faith. He's pointing out the problem, but He wants them to trust God. Verses 31 and 32. Do not worry then, saying, What will we eat? If you trust God, you don't have to worry about that because it's under the Mosaic Law. Or what will we drink? Or what will we wear for clothing? Then notice what he says next. For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. So unlike the Gentiles who had no covenant with God, the Jews had the Mosaic Law. So he reminds them again, all the Gentiles want these things too. I mean, who in this world doesn't want that? But he's pointing out, you're not the Gentiles. You're the Jews under the Mosaic Law. And God has made specific promises to you, especially as a nation. If the nation was faithful, God would bless the nation. He would protect the nation. If the nation had been faithful, the Romans wouldn't have been in control. The Jews would have been in control. But that also shows you their lack of faith. Again, they wanted these just like the Gentiles did. The Gentiles did not have the Mosaic Law. God knew their needs. He knew the needs of the Jews. And as they were faithful, and remember it's a conditional covenant, He promised to give them food, drink, clothing, whatever they needed. From there, Jesus sums up God's promise in the Mosaic Law in verse 33. Speaking to Jews under the law, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So Jesus here reminded the Jews that if they were faithful, if they faithfully sought God's kingdom and sought to be right with God, then all the promises of the Mosaic Law would be added to them. This is simple 101 Mosaic Law. That's what it is. You be faithful, God is faithful with His promises. God will bless you. God will take care of you. You will prosper. As a nation, you will prosper. You will not be defeated. This was a simple reminder of the guarantees made by God to a faithful Israel. And the reality is, Jesus is coming as the Messiah. Can you imagine? I mean, we can only imagine because it didn't happen. But can you imagine what would have happened if the nation would have turned to Him in faith? If the nation would have turned to Jesus in faith, not only was there a spiritual kingdom that would be there, but the physical kingdom would be there as well. The Roman armies would be defeated. They could not stand up against God and a faithful Israel. But by the way, we know that didn't happen. But we also know that in the future, Israel will come to faith in God. And when they do, as Christ is returning, they're going to, as Zechariah says, they will look upon the one they have pierced. That can't be anybody but Jesus Christ. And as a nation, they will realize the error that they made. And as Zechariah says, they will mourn as one mourns for a son that is dead. But the good news is, He is alive. He is alive, and He's bringing His kingdom. And you know what's even better than that? For us, we're going to be there too. That's the amazing thing. In that kingdom. So again, this was just a simple reminder of the guarantees made by God to a faithful Israel. That's all it is here. And so it's important to note that this is not a guarantee to Christians. We're not under the law. Mosaic law is obsolete, and our covenant is greater. God did not take this, or rather, you should not take this promise out of context. It is part of the Old Covenant law. In the New Covenant, there's no guarantees for physical safety. We know through history that is absolutely true. That we are promised is the forgiveness of sin because of the cross. We are promised resurrection life, which we have the very moment we put our faith in Jesus Christ. We are promised, as we reflect Christ, the fruit of the Spirit to be produced through us. Remember, it's the fruit of the Spirit. It's not the fruit of you. Now, you've got to want God to present His Spirit, fruit of the Spirit through you. You've got to be a part of that. but it's His fruit because it is a reflection of Jesus Christ. You look at the fruit of the Spirit, and that is just a description of Jesus Christ. So as we reflect Christ, the fruit is produced. We are also promised a glorified body when this life is over. These are the promises that we have, and they are greater than old covenant promises. We are not promised wealth. We are not promised health for our faithfulness. There are many preachers that are trying to give you baloney about health and wealth gospel. It's not true. And this health and wealth gospel, I can tell you about all the preachers that have preached that in years past. You know what happens to them? They die. If health and wealth was true, why would they die? Why would they need glasses as they got older? Why would they need hearing aids if it was true that they had health through their faith? Oh, the health that is coming is the glorified body. That's the health. But that's in the future. Finally, verse 34, he says, so, or therefore, summing things up here, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. So therefore, based on God's guarantees in the Mosaic Law, there is no need for faithful Jews to worry. No need at all. If the nation would just put their faith in their Messiah, all of their needs would be taken care of. So they didn't need to worry about God's provision if they were faithful. They didn't need to worry about tomorrows because God would take care of their tomorrows as well. They just had to believe. So Jesus starts this section by talking more about a couple of errors that the Jews were commonly making with fasting and treasures. But he also reminded them of God's great promise under the Mosaic Law. And he said, seek first this promise, the Mosaic Law, and all these things will be added to you. But I want to point out again, Christians, today there is no promise in the new covenant of that same physical protection. It's not there. There are Christians that have lost their lives for faith in Jesus Christ, and the numbers are countless. And even in the previous century, there were Christians all around the world that were dying for their faith in Jesus Christ. Our covenant is a new covenant. It is a greater covenant. It contains forgiveness. It contains resurrection life. It contains the reality of the fruit of the Spirit being produced in us as we reflect Jesus Christ. It contains the promise of a resurrected, glorified body and an eternity with our Lord and Savior and all other believers throughout time. That is much greater than physical things in this life. Let's pray.